What would you do if your HOA tried to steal the home your grandfather left you, just because they thought you were too young to own it? When my grandfather passed away, I wasn't just grieving the loss of the man who raised me. I was trying to hold on to the one place that still felt like home. The house he left me wasn't just any property, it was the place where I grew up after my parents' accident. It had seen birthdays, scraped knees, and late-night talks on the front porch about life and responsibility. It was paid off decades ago, a well-maintained craftsman-style home in a quiet suburban neighborhood. And I had every legal right to live there. But that didn't matter to the HOA. For the first few months after inheriting the house, everything seemed fine. I paid the modest $150 monthly HOA fees on time, followed all the rules, and even attended a couple of meetings, though I mostly stayed quiet since I was the youngest person there by at least 20 years. I kept the yard trimmed, the driveway clear, and the house in perfect condition. But I should have known something was off the moment Karen Matthews, the HOA president, started making casual comments about how adults should handle property ownership. At first, I brushed it off. Maybe she just wasn't used to seeing a college student as a homeowner. Then the letters started arriving. First, it was nitpicky violations. My grass was half an inch too tall, my fence was outdated, even though it had been freshly painted last summer. Then, one day, I came home from class to find a city inspector standing in my driveway, clipboard in hand. According to him, there were several compliance issues that needed immediate attention. When I asked to see the violations, his response stunned me. Most of them were new HOA regulations that had just been passed. Regulations that, as I later found out, Karen personally pushed through last year. I confronted her after the next HOA meeting, but she just smiled, that smug, infuriating smirk of someone who believes they've already won. If you had a more experienced homeowner guiding you, maybe you wouldn't be struggling. That's when I realized the truth. This wasn't about rules or regulations. Karen wanted me gone. A week after my run-in with the city inspector, a certified letter arrived in the mail. The envelope had the HOA's official seal, and the moment I saw Karen's signature at the bottom of the page, my stomach sank. The letter claimed that according to the HOA's bylaws, all property owners must be at least 25 years old. Since I was only 23, I had 30 days to sell the house or transfer ownership to a qualifying adult. If I failed to comply, the HOA had the right to enforce the sale of my property. I read the letter 3 times, my pulse pounding in my ears. There was no way this was real. I immediately dug through my grandfather's old HOA paperwork, scouring every page. Nowhere in the bylaws, not in a single version dating back to the HOA's formation, was there any mention of an age requirement. This was a blatant lie. Furious, I called my lawyer, the same one who had handled my grandfather's estate transfer. When I explained the situation, he was quiet for a moment before sighing. "This isn't the first time I've heard of an HOA pulling something like this," he said. "But the good news is, they don't have a legal leg to stand on." Armed with this information, I sent a formal response demanding they provide proof of this supposed age restriction. Karen's reply was as infuriating as it was dismissive. She didn't send any documentation, just a condescending note stating that the board has determined you do not meet ownership requirements, but was extending my deadline by 15 days as a courtesy. The absolute nerve of this woman. At the next HOA meeting, I arrived early, determined to call Karen out in front of the entire board. But when the meeting started, she conveniently refused to let me speak during the open comments period. When I tried to object, she cut me off with a fake smile. "I'm sorry, but only valid property owners are permitted to address the board," she said, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. I gritted my teeth as several members nodded along, already convinced I didn't belong there. That's when I realized Karen wasn't just trying to take my house, she was turning the entire community against me. Within days, the rumors started spreading. Some neighbors, the ones who had always been friendly, suddenly stopped making eye contact when I walked by. Others actively avoided me, crossing the street instead of waving from their driveways like they used to. Then I overheard two women talking outside the mailbox station. "I heard he's been throwing parties," one of them said in a hushed tone. "And vandalizing HOA property." I turned the corner, and both of them fell silent, eyes darting away like I wasn't standing 10 feet from them. Karen wasn't just making things difficult for me legally, she was systematically destroying my reputation. When I confronted my next-door neighbor, an older guy named Tom who had always been friendly, he looked uncomfortable but eventually admitted what was happening. "Karen's been telling people you're not taking care of the house. That you're disrespecting the neighborhood standards," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. I let out a dry laugh. "And you believe her?" Tom hesitated. "Look, I don't want to get involved, okay? But people are talking." That's when it hit me, this wasn't just about making my life difficult. Karen wanted me completely isolated. If she could turn the entire neighborhood against me, there would be no one left to support me when I fought back. No one to care when she finally made her move to take my house. I wasn't just dealing with a corrupt HOA president. I was dealing with a professional manipulator. But what Karen didn't know was that I had already hired a lawyer. And he was about to uncover something that would change everything. I woke up to the sound of hammering. Not the kind you'd expect from a neighbor doing routine maintenance, the kind that sent a jolt of alarm straight to my gut. I threw on a hoodie, shoved my feet into my sneakers, and rushed outside. A group of workers, all wearing neon vests but with no clear company logos, were ripping apart my front porch. Pieces of wood were already stacked by the curb, and one guy was using a crowbar to pry off my railing. "What the hell are you doing?" I shouted, storming up the steps, or what was left of them. One of the workers, a man with paint-stained jeans, barely glanced at me before going back to his work. "Mandatory exterior compliance updates, ordered by the HOA," he muttered. I snatched the clipboard from his hands, scanning the paperwork. It wasn't a real maintenance order. There was no city permit, no official documentation, just a flimsy HOA notice with Karen's signature. That smug, satisfied smile she'd given me at the last meeting flashed through my mind. This wasn't about compliance. She was escalating. I pulled out my phone and took pictures of everything. The missing porch railing. The torn-up planks. The workers who suddenly looked nervous when I started recording. "You have no legal right to do this," I said, keeping my voice steady, but my hands were clenched into fists. "Get off my property before I call the cops." The workers hesitated, exchanging glances. One of them, maybe the foreman, made a quick call and nodded to the others. Within minutes, they packed up their tools and left. I didn't need to guess who they had just called. I went inside, my stomach twisting, and called my lawyer. But before I could even explain the situation, the smoke alarm started blaring. The kitchen. I sprinted down the hallway and was immediately hit with the acrid stench of burning plastic. Flames flickered at the base of the cabinets, crawling up toward the ceiling. I grabbed the fire extinguisher from under the sink and doused the flames, coughing through the thickening smoke. By the time the fire department arrived, the flames were out, but the damage had been done. The lower cabinets were scorched, the countertops cracked from the heat, and the air was thick with the sharp tang of melted insulation. The fire chief crouched near the wall, inspecting the damage. "Looks like faulty wiring," he muttered. "These wires were stripped bare. Who's been working on your house?" I swallowed hard. The workers. The ones Karen had sent. But Karen's response when I confronted her? Pure, calculated indifference. "If you had sold when I told you to," she said, crossing her arms, "this wouldn't have happened." I stared at her, barely able to process the sheer audacity. She was standing in front of my half-destroyed home, smirking like this was some game she was winning. This wasn't just a property dispute anymore. Karen was willing to destroy my home, maybe even put me in danger, to force me out. And she wasn't done. 2 days later, a thick packet arrived from the HOA. It was another certified letter, this time announcing that my house had already been sold. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. They had pushed through the sale without my consent, using some obscure enforcement clause buried deep in the HOA's rules, one that allowed them to sell non-compliant properties to prevent neighborhood deterioration. The buyer? An LLC owned by Karen's husband. And the sale price? $275,000, for a home worth at least $450,000. I dropped the letter, my hands shaking. I had 72 hours to vacate. I wasn't just dealing with a power-hungry HOA president. I was dealing with a corrupt, well-oiled machine designed to rip homeowners out of their properties and profit off their losses. But Karen had underestimated me. Because I had been documenting everything. And I wasn't going down without a fight. I sat in my half-destroyed living room, the eviction notice still clutched in my hands, but I wasn't panicking anymore. I wasn't even angry, not in the way I had been before. That raw, helpless rage had transformed into something sharper, colder. Karen thought she had won. She thought I would pack up, slink away, and let her steal the home my grandfather had left me. She had no idea what was coming. I grabbed my phone and called my lawyer. We're going scorched earth. Within 24 hours, my lawyer had filed an emergency injunction to halt the fraudulent sale. But this wasn't just about my house anymore. The more we dug, the worse it got. Karen hadn't just targeted me. She had been running a full-blown real estate racket for years. The forensic accountants I hired uncovered dozens of suspicious property transfers, elderly residents who had suddenly decided to sell for below-market prices, heirs who had been pressured into letting their homes go, families who had been hit with so many bogus violations that they gave up fighting and moved out. Millions of dollars had passed through HOA-controlled sales, and a significant portion of it led right back to Karen and her cronies. And the real kicker? The LLC that had bought my house? It had been created 2 days before the sale. The owner? Karen's husband. Armed with this evidence, my lawyer escalated things beyond civil court. He took it to the state attorney general's office. When they saw what we had, they immediately launched an investigation. Then the FBI got involved. Karen had made one critical mistake: she wasn't just screwing over individual homeowners. She was committing organized, large-scale fraud. And the government took that very, very seriously. The moment the subpoenas started flying, Karen's carefully constructed empire began to crumble. At first, she refused to acknowledge anything. She was still smug, still playing the role of the righteous HOA president. We were just following protocol, she insisted. If people couldn't meet the community's standards, that's not my fault. But when the deposition started, her board members turned on her. One by one, they cut deals to save themselves. They handed over emails, meeting recordings, financial statements, all of it pointing to Karen as the mastermind. And when Karen was confronted with that evidence, that's when the real meltdown happened. It started in court. She had been trying to act composed, like she still had control. But when my lawyer presented the proof that she had personally bribed the HOA's attorney to delay my case, her mask cracked. She stood up and started screaming. "This is my neighborhood," she shrieked, pointing at the judge. "I built this community. I kept it from turning into a goddamn dump. You're all turning on me now." The judge slammed his gavel. "Sit down." But she didn't. She kept ranting about how kids like me didn't deserve to own homes, how the neighborhood had been better off when real adults were in charge, how she was being targeted for trying to keep property values high. It would have been pathetic if it wasn't so satisfying. Karen was immediately held in contempt of court. But the real blow came when the judge voided the sale of my home, ruling that the HOA had committed blatant fraud. And the financial consequences? Brutal. Not only did Karen and her co-conspirators have to pay me $1.2 million in damages, but the class action lawsuit that followed, filed by other victims of her scam, cost them another $4.5 million. But it didn't stop there. The FBI's forensic accountants had uncovered massive embezzlement within the HOA's funds. The money that was supposed to go toward neighborhood maintenance? Karen and her board had been funneling it into fake repair projects that were actually just their personal bank accounts. The state seized their assets. Karen's properties were liquidated. Her husband's LLC was shut down. And then came the final hammer: Karen was arrested. Fraud. Embezzlement. Conspiracy. Elder abuse. The list of charges was long, and the judge wasn't feeling merciful. Karen, her husband, and 3 of her closest co-conspirators were sentenced to prison. Karen got 3 years. The others got between 18 months and 2 years. The day she was taken into custody, she passed me outside the courthouse. Her face was red, her carefully styled hair disheveled, her hands cuffed in front of her. She glared at me, eyes filled with pure hatred. "I hope you're happy," she spat. I smiled. "No, Karen. I'm just getting started." With Karen behind bars and her empire in ruins, the neighborhood began to heal. The HOA underwent a complete overhaul, with a new board elected under court supervision. Strict financial transparency laws were put in place, ensuring no future president could manipulate the system for personal gain. An independent management company was brought in to handle daily operations, cutting out any possibility of another Karen rising to power. For the first time in years, homeowners actually had a say in how their community was run. Property values didn't plummet like Karen had predicted. In fact, they rose. Buyers were more interested in moving into a neighborhood with honest leadership than one where predatory scams thrived. With the fraudulent fines and fees gone, residents could finally afford to improve their homes, and the changes were visible. Freshly painted exteriors, newly landscaped yards, and repaired sidewalks replaced the decay that Karen had let spread while she lined her own pockets. The transformation wasn't just physical, it was in the atmosphere. People weren't walking on eggshells anymore. They greeted each other at the mailbox station. They held community events again. For me, this fight became something bigger than just getting my home back. With part of my settlement, I founded a nonprofit dedicated to fighting HOA fraud and abuse. We started helping other homeowners who had been bullied and manipulated just like I had, providing legal support and resources to expose corrupt HOAs. It didn't take long for cases just like mine to pour in from across the country. Some were even worse: families who had lost their homes, elderly homeowners targeted in their final years, neighborhoods where HOA boards operated like personal fiefdoms. The exposure led to something even more unexpected. The state legislature passed the Homeowner Protection Act, incorporating many of the reforms we had pushed for. It included mandatory audits, background checks for board members, and strict limits on HOA enforcement powers. The law was directly inspired by our case, ensuring that no one else could be forced out of their home the way I had almost been. I still live in my grandfather's house. It's been fully restored, a symbol of everything we fought for. The garden he loved is thriving again, and sometimes, when I sit on the porch he built, I can still feel his presence. I know he'd be proud, not just because I got justice, but because I turned his home into the starting point for something bigger. HOAs were supposed to protect homeowners, not destroy them. But how many people have lost everything because no one fought back? Have you ever felt powerless against HOA or Karen rules? Share your experiences below. Let's see who had it worse.